Hello.
Hi, how are you doing?
I'm good. Thank
Sorry
you
that
so much.
took a minute that time to connect. So,
Oh, no, no worries. It happens. But thank you so much for your time again. And
absolutely.
yes, everybody, this is Sasha Huston Brown, and she is a writer and consultant for the Native American community in Minneapolis. And excuse me if I butcher this, but she's also from the Dakota Nation people. And thank you so much for taking the time to doing this. I'm so excited. I'm telling all my friends that you're my first out-of-state uh, friend and now speaker here. So thank you.
Yeah, I'm really excited and I think, doing more of this of like just cross-cultural dialogue and building with each other. I think I said before too, it's like, a lot of times there's so much energy put towards educating white folks and combating racism and that there's not as much time that's actually there to build with each other and learn from each other.
Definitely. I think that's why I appreciate, this, just being able
Hmm.
to spend the time to learn from your community, me being an Asian American, you,
Hmm.
um, you know, bringing in all this rich history and knowledge that I and a lot of people lack. So I
Yep.
appreciate that.
Yeah.
So, let's dive into it. Let's start chatting. So I actually wanted to know your insights because I read that article that you wrote
Hmm.
about how COVID is affecting the Native American community, specifically in Minneapolis.
Yeah, so I, also work in kind of public health and communications around prevention and public health.
Mm,
And I would say, right now, we know the reality that COVID is disproportionately impacting Black, Indigenous, immigrants, and communities of color.
right. Hmm.
And that's really because, a lot of times we get pushback and it's like, okay, well, why? And there's this
Mm,
kind of inference that there's a genetic element or, blaming BIPOC communities for that
mm,
reality. And I think,
hmm.
I always try in my own public health communications to be really clear that that is because of, systemic racism. And
Mm,
it's because of the health inequities that were already there before COVID. And now we're seeing them, they're more illuminated for folks who couldn't see them before.
hmm.
And Native folks and tribal nations are being hit really hard right now.
I see.
And there's a lot of factors going on. I think first of all, we know that Black immigrant and Indigenous communities tend to live in multi-generational households compared to white folks. We also
Hmm.
know because of systemic racism and poverty that folks tend to have things like frontline jobs more often or are
Mm,
essential workers.
right.
There isn't the luxury and privilege that I have and I definitely own of being able to work from
Mm,
home.
yes.
And then we also know that the healthcare system in general has failed our communities. For example, a lot of times I
Hmm.
think it can be kind of complex to explain what Indian Health Service is to non-Native folks.
Right.
But Indian Health Services is basically an agreement by treaty by the federal government
Mm,
that, they are basically supposed to make something that's a very complicated, simple, take care of Indigenous people's health, enrolled tribal members' health in perpetuity.
mm,
And so we have our own healthcare systems. And
mm.
in my opinion, those are also grossly inadequate. So if we
Oh,
look at the
wow.
numbers, for example, I can send this to you to share with folks.
Sure.
This
Yeah.
comes from the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights' most recent data, and
Hmm.
so we know right now that the federal government spends an average of $2,834 per person on healthcare in Indian country. Now,
Wow.
let's also compare that to what they spend for folks on Medicare. That would be $12,744.
Oh my gosh.
So it's
Yeah.
completely, it is not helping, our true health. It's not a system
Hmm.
that is allowed to do things like prevention or meet the needs of the communities. It's a
Mm.
system, and people use it because it's really the only option frequently, but it really isn't, what it should be, is what I'll say. Um, there's been progress that's been made, but
Hmm.
there's a lot more that needs to be done. And I think so. You take into consideration too, a lot of folks who live on reservations, depending on where they are. So Navajo Nation has been one of the hardest hit. And a lot of folks, don't realize too that, a lot of people, who live there in the community still lack things like access to healthy, clean, running water.
Yeah.
Just proximity, too, is huge. And then you combine that with very real distrust of,
Mm,
even healthcare too, which is founded on a very real,
right.
history.
Yeah.
And there's just kind of this situation that unfortunately has made it very ripe, conditions for COVID to take hold. And then, yeah, I would say in Minneapolis, in the urban community here, you're definitely seeing cases, and Minnesota has been better than a lot of other states in
Yeah.
terms of taking and mandating action. So we aren't seeing the numbers that you are in other places across the
We are
country.
just firing up.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But here too, it's like numbers are still growing, every day
Mm,
here.
hmm,
So
hmm.
it's definitely scary. Just thinking about folks, who are in the urban area, and then thinking about the tribes. Minnesota is home to 11 different tribal nations,
Oh, wow.
and there's so much
Hmm.
concern too, what's going to happen. And even things like, ensuring food security and all of these other factors during this time is really challenging. And we haven't
Hmm.
been impacted, like I said, in the same way other folks have been, which is, I'm grateful for, but that
Hmm.
doesn't mean it's not, going to happen.
Right. So I think that's thank you for sharing. It's
Yeah.
interesting because we're hearing so many problems, like you said, from different diverse groups,
Hmm.
underrepresented groups who need this help. I'm not a
Yeah.
healthcare professional. I'm also not in politics, but you have kind of seen it and written about it. What
Yeah.
what are things that are kind of needed to kind of help improve? This is kind of a long, big-winded question, but the systematic racism that really did we see this happen too for the Black community, Hispanic and Latinx community,
Yep.
even lower income Asian communities too talk about this as
Hmm.
well.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. I mean, it's a huge issue, and I think too, like, for our communities in particular, like there just needs to be more resources.
Mm.
There needs to be more resources. And then I also like, the issue of tribal sovereignty does come in here, where, there are tribal nations who have closed their borders. So, for example, in
Yeah, I've
South
read.
Dakota, folks
Yeah.
have understandably said, as sovereign nations, we are going to close our borders and we have the right to do that to folks
Mm.
outside
Right.
of the tribe. And
Mm.
that is really for the protection of our tribal citizens, our
Mm-hmm.
elders, and vulnerable community members. And, folks who are unfortunately even in governance don't understand that
Mm.
and have challenged it. So, for
Oh,
example,
wow.
in North Dakota, South Dakota, tribes have been met with challenges to exercising their own sovereignty when they're
From
simply
outside? Like,
mhm,
oh,
from
I see.
from from governors,
I
mayors,
see.
when they're simply trying to protect their people and do what's right.
Mm.
Although there have been positive instances where tribes can also say, mandate things like face masks in
Mm-hmm.
states where there isn't a state mandate. So there
Mm.
is the unique kind of because of our political status where you're able to do things like that. But then the challenge is what happens when folks have to go off res to get food, to, do whatever,
Right.
and the
Yeah.
exposure there.
Oh,
Um,
wow.
yeah, and also the food security is huge, recognizing, understanding, I think, for a lot of folks too, most tribal kind of communities, especially depending on your geography, aren't
Mm-hmm.
necessarily going to have, a full service, multiple grocery stores to accommodate folks to be
Mm.
able to social distance. A lot of folks have to go off res to do things like get food, go to, get other services. So, I think there's that threat too, even when you can close your borders or mandate masks, that's
Mm.
still very real. I know in my own community, and I lived in Minneapolis my whole life. I'm, a city girl. I'm always really
Oh,
try to be
wow.
transparent about that. And also that I'm half white. I'm always try to, just be really transparent about my own identity.
Sure,
And
yeah.
coming from, that background, which has very much shaped my own experience.
Mm.
But my dad lives on our reservation, which is in Nebraska.
Mm-hmm.
And so
Oh,
in Minnesota, Minneapolis, this is kind of this would be my kind of ancestral homelands on my Dakota side.
that's
And we
awesome.
were forcibly removed and relocated in
Oh,
following 1862 and the uprising that took place here. And so we were forcibly removed, relocated out of Minnesota following the largest mass execution in United States history, where
oh.
38 Dakota men were hung in Mankato, Minnesota the day after Christmas. And a
Oh
lot of
my
people don't know
gosh.
this history.
No. Yeah.
And so what ended up happening is, for example, our people ended up in Nebraska.
Mm.
Originally, we ended up in South Dakota in Crow Creek, and then they removed us even further. So then we went to Nebraska. And
Mm-hmm.
so that's where that territory actually, used to be the Poncas territory. So
Mm.
it's not our ancestral homelands, but that's where
Mm.
our reservation is established. That's where my dad lives.
Oh wow.
And so, for example, when we think about COVID too, one of the issues for him is that he's on dialysis, and so our tribe
Mm.
doesn't have a dialysis unit. So he has to go
Mm.
off res with a group of elders, I think
Oh
3 to 4
wow.
times per week to a hospital in South Dakota, which is the nearest spot to get dialysis.
Oh.
And so, there's a huge risk there that
Mm.
comes, which is a result of poverty and a lack of
Mm.
access. Folks are doing everything they can to protect themselves, but in order to receive life-saving treatment, they actually have to go off-res into a hospital. And
Mm.
we've been really fortunate that he's not gotten sick. He's been able to stay
Yes.
healthy.
That's great.
He's gotten masks for his elders group, in their
Oh.
van.
Yeah.
But it's also the reality too of like being really clear that, that doesn't mean that there isn't a huge risk there as well.
Thank you for kind of giving us this open of a worldview into the Native American community, which is there. It's very humbling to see, how much that we've got to fight for and come
Mm-hmm.
together to hopefully help and come together. And I'm also really interested in kind of your opinion. Everyone has their own opinion, not necessarily for their own community, but
Yeah.
in the whole thing of the NFL team name change that's been
Mm-hmm.
happening lately, and the Mount Rushmore issue that happened during the 4th of July.
Yeah.
Can you, I mean, first of all, congrats to the community.
Yeah.
Why now, 2020? But amazing to be able to finally, after all these things that happened, Kaepernick
Mm-hmm.
and everything. So
Totally.
please share your opinion. I'd love to hear.
Absolutely. I think it's like recognizing, the fight has been going on for so long, and there's so many folks who have put their lives out there. I think about there's a woman, Amanda Blackhorse, who is incredible. She actually took up
I've
a
heard
lawsuit
about her.
against the team, and she has endured
Oh
so
wow.
much,
Mm-hmm.
hatred. I mean, so much, violence for actually putting herself out there. And so I think
Man,
there's
it's
people,
hard.
yeah, there's people
Yeah.
like that where I just have so much respect for the
Mm-hmm.
work that they've done. And also thinking
Mm-hmm.
about, the generations, before me. I know even, my dad's generation was working on this issue,
Yeah.
that it was very real. I remember even, in the 90s, during the Super Bowl here in Minnesota when, Washington was here, like this was an issue then,
Mm-hmm.
and, it's since the name was established, it's been an issue. And even before
Yeah.
that, racist mascots have been an issue. So,
Right.
um, I know I talked about it to my dad. He's like, he was just real. He's like, there's been too many good things happening to us as Native peoples lately.
Oh,
Like he's waiting for like something bad to happen just because it's almost like,
it's
you
life.
get so used to,
Oh yeah.
a reality where you are
Mm-hmm.
not listened to, or, you are
Mm.
completely not even allowed to participate in the conversation. And I
Mm.
think we're starting to see this change right now. And while it's beautiful, it's, I know, like
Mm-hmm.
for older generations, just understandably skeptical at the same time.
Mm.
But I'm, just really grateful for all of the folks who have been working on the issue.
Mm-hmm.
Somebody who I think is done a lot of really incredible research that I think I like to point folks towards is Dr. Stephanie Freiberg.
Mm.
And, she is an Indigenous woman, and she's a, PhD. She's a researcher, and she's really focused on the consequences of racist mascots on Indigenous youth.
Mm.
And then she's also looked at, I think, I don't know if folks are familiar, but, Washington is also very much, that team has used, very much been opportunistic in getting certain Native folks or Native folks to come out and be like, oh, I'm not offended by the team
Oh,
name,
really?
and
I
therefore
didn't know
speak
that.
for all Native people. And
Yeah.
so, Stephanie has actually done a ton of research into how does your connection to your own culture and your participation in community activities or
Mm-hmm.
ceremony or
Yes.
language impact, how you, actually feel about, racist mascots. And what her research
Right.
has found is that, it's folks who have maybe no lived experience as an Indigenous person or connection, active connection to their culture or participation in ceremony, language, or community.
Mm-hmm.
They might have ancestry, but they don't have a lived
Right.
identity.
Right.
That are these folks who are out there saying, oh, I have a, Native grandma, or I have Native lineage and I'm not
Mm-hmm.
offended.
Without the
And,
context, yeah.
exactly. But if you look, she's done such incredible things. And these studies that also, we shouldn't have to document this, but unfortunately we do have to like
We do.
legitimize it, right?
Yes.
That show, no, folks who actually, have these connections absolutely feel very strong against racist mascots.
Mm-hmm.
And then her research has also been picked up by, different psychological associations to show
Oh,
the detrimental impacts, and that it's really not
wow.
just about
Mm-hmm.
a symbol, it's also about how youth in particular see themselves.
Yes. Yes.
So,
Agreed.
which is huge. And I think, this to a certain degree,
Mm-hmm.
I think a lot of other communities, BIPOC communities, immigrant communities can really
Mm-hmm.
understand how representation and
Yeah.
how you are depicted by
Mm-hmm.
white folks in mainstream media
Mm-hmm.
not only shapes how you see yourself, but I think it also limits what we think we can achieve, right? And that's
Right.
what her research has really found. So one of the things she found too is that, there's a direct correlation between racist mascots and things like, for example, self-harm amongst Native youth,
Mm-hmm.
depression, suicidal ideation,
Mm-hmm.
and that, lower self-esteem,
Mm-hmm.
and also, I'm just reading this right here because I took
Oh
some
no,
notes,
please share. No, please. This is great.
increasing rates of self-harm and substance abuse.
Mm.
And then it's not just the mascot itself, it's also the fan behavior that's associated with it. Right?
Yeah.
I mean, if you've ever been
The
to,
cultural
yeah,
appropriation.
if you've ever been to some
Mm-hmm.
of these, I mean, the fans, I mean, it's pretty extreme in terms of what you see. And
Yeah.
as a young person, I think that subconsciously you are absolutely internalizing, like,
Mm.
especially when we don't have real and, visibility of
Right.
contemporary Native folks,
Mm-hmm.
and that this is
Mm-hmm.
sometimes the only representation
Yes.
of our communities. Like, what does that do psychologically?
Mm.
And so, I think it's also, I saw we were out of town and we came back and I saw, okay, the name is just the Washington football team.
I
So
saw.
I'm curious to what it will maybe be changed to, but I'm very happy with that in the interim.
Mm-hmm.
And I think of just all the folks who have fought so hard, like you had mentioned, to make
Mm-hmm.
this a reality.
Wow. I think I have a big supportive, advocacy for mental health and all of that too. So it's really interesting to connect, what you said about the whole psychological issues. Because even when I was in school, the college football teams, I
Yep.
mean, you never think about that, but now it is time to be more aware and at
Hmm.
least, little things for us too, even like in the Asian American community, being called a chink, and
Exactly.
it's even if it was a joke, I think it, I when I think of young people too, that's why, media is, like you said, a very strong, powerful
Totally.
tool.
Yep.
Um,
And
so
even, yeah, even I know,
yeah,
like, looking at how, very deliberately, like, American society has depicted, Chinese American, Hmong, different Asian American communities as
yes, well,
caricatures very
mm-hmm,
deliberately, in the same
mm-hmm,
way.
mm-hmm,
It's like I think it's about the dehumanization too, and how we internalize
yeah,
that, even if we don't think
mm-hmm.
we are.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting. That's why we're having these conversations to bring forth to understand, like, hey, you're going through this too, just like
Hmm.
us, and kind of bringing that into light more.
For sure.
And you coming from Minneapolis, and understanding kind of that experience during the Black Lives Matter movement and
Hmm.
the George Floyd incident. Um, can you please kind of share your thoughts as an advocate coming from the Native American community, and even for me owning that Asian cop who put his
Hmm.
knee down, and even though it was hard for me to
Hmm.
personally be like, oh no, one of our people, but
Hmm.
it is taking responsibility and, as an advocate, and saying like,
Hmm.
this is not right. And the
Hmm.
Hmong community, which I don't know too much about either, but I've read
Yeah.
about, a little bit of that. So please share kind of your thoughts. Yeah.
Yeah, I was thinking about this question and being really clear, I think for me, like wanting to first amplify and uplift Black voices on the issue,
Mm-hmm.
right? And being really clear about my own privilege, and being somebody
Mm-hmm.
who can be white passing, being somebody
Mm-hmm.
who's light skinned, you know, who I have my own experience, but I also, I think, owning that I will never understand certain
Right.
things, particularly what
Right.
it's like to be a Black man in America.
Yes.
Um, and so I think, you know, living in Minneapolis, what I thought about too was that, you know, as it was really painful and just horrific to see.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And on one level, like I know this sounds really off, but I wasn't surprised.
Mm-hmm.
And I think because particularly here, like people see Minneapolis and it's touted, you know, we always get, okay, you know, healthiest city, or, you know, thriving economy, or
Mm-hmm.
Minnesota nice. And a lot of folks don't know, unless you actually are from here, that we're actually home to some of the greatest racial health inequities and,
Mm-hmm.
you know, racial educational gaps in the
Mm-hmm.
nation.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we were actually named, we've been named one of the top 3 worst cities in the country for Black people,
Oh,
in
wow.
America. Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
You know, and so it's, you know, painted as this Minnesota nice image. And I think what
Mm-hmm.
Minnesota nice is actually just a really ugly and passive form of racism frequently. And there's so much work that needs to happen here. And I think what ended up happening with the murder of George Floyd is like, I think, you know, the world got to see our
Mm-hmm.
city. I mean, for the amazing, you know, social justice and community leaders, those got to
Mm-hmm.
be seen, and for the horrific, you know, just brutal racism that is very much alive here. And I
Mm-hmm.
don't think folks had seen that as much. I mean, obviously, we're not new to this. You know, we think
Mm-hmm.
about all the other, you know, Black men and women who have already, you know, died here, who have been murdered
Mm-hmm.
here.
Yeah.
And it's like enough is enough. And I think, you know, for me being here, I just really tried to also take a step back and not center myself,
Mm-hmm.
and try to figure out how do I also, like you were saying too, reckon with my own, you know, kind of lived privileges,
Right.
and how do I also be a better ally to the Black community. In
Mm-hmm.
the same way, like we're having this conversation now,
Yeah.
just being able to like listen and also, you know, learn, not center myself,
Mm-hmm.
and try to show up where needed without,
Mm-hmm.
you know, trying to make it about me. Uh,
Right.
which is a journey, and I'm not always perfect at by any means.
Oh,
But
definitely.
just
Same.
trying. Um,
It's a
but I
challenge.
also think exactly there's been so much heartbreak here, you know, but
Mm-hmm.
there's also been a lot of beauty in terms of community coming together,
Mm.
standing up, being vocal, and really creating a lot of change.
Mm. Have
And
you
we, yeah.
seen?
Oh,
Oh,
go
please
ahead.
go ahead.
Yeah.
Oh, no, no.
No. Yeah, I mean,
Uh,
and we actually live really close by, what used to be the
yeah.
third precinct. So I mean, it was wild here. Because
Oh,
of
wow.
COVID, I was not actively out. We also live with my mom, and so I'm also conscientious. You know,
Same.
you almost have to like pick and choose. Like I hate to
Your
say, but
battles. Yeah.
I had to choose when I would go out, and also the reality of like amidst the pandemic, you know,
Mm-hmm.
it's been great that they've also done a lot of contact tracing and been able to show, you know, the protests didn't actually increase any rates of the virus, which is
Oh,
huge
really?
here.
That's great.
Yeah, I mean, I think there
Mm-hmm.
was still a lot of self-care and community care at
Mm.
the court. People were wearing masks, being, you
Mm.
know, outside. But yeah, I had to limit my own kind of, you know, engagement with
Of
outside as
course.
much as I kind of may have wanted to, but just kind of
Mm-hmm.
being real about that. But you could hear, I mean, I would say for like a week straight, we heard, you know, helicopters overhead. You saw, you know,
Wow.
different, you know, it was loud. There were sirens. There was, I mean, everything. It was really intense.
I
Um,
mean,
and-
it's great that it's intense coming from, I mean, I'm sure it's scary, but I think the
yeah,
amount of people protesting and the support, but also, the safety factor, I'm sure. Um,
for sure.
but
Yeah.
how do you think, I'm always curious to know like the feeling, of you're so close to it. Do you really feel like there is a change even in your own city
I
of
I definitely
people and
do.
hearts? Yeah.
Yeah, I do. And I think it's this balance of like I think there's a lot of white folks who it shouldn't have had to take this for folks to wake up,
Mm.
but it kind of did. And
I fall
so,
victim to that too.
oh,
Yeah.
absolutely. I think,
Hmm.
same too.
Hmm.
And I think that there are folks who are trying to figure out and deal with their own either complicity or their
Mm-hmm.
own, how they benefit from white supremacy and really trying
Mm-hmm.
to educate themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And I do think you see communities coming together. I know, there was a lot of folks from the Native community out there, supporting Black Lives Matter, marching, being there in solidarity.
Mm-hmm.
The American Indian movement came out and was there around
Oh,
security because
good.
there was a very real threat around,
Mm-hmm.
outside agitators, infiltrators coming in
Mm-hmm.
from the Boogaloo Boys, different, kind of white nationalist or white supremacist groups
Mm.
who were
Oh, yeah,
taking
yeah, yeah.
advantage, right, of the
Yeah.
protesters, and doing things like, starting the fires, doing things like, a lot of the
Mm.
destruction of property here in the Twin Cities. And I think, you
Yeah.
did see folks, have to go do, community policing around some of
Mm-hmm.
these,
It's horrible.
folks. And so even like the American Indie movement was out there. I know they caught a group of young white high school boys raiding a liquor store, and they
Oh,
were from, I
man.
think they were from Wisconsin.
Oh,
And
wow.
they got them. They had them out on the ground by this liquor store. There's a Facebook Live video of it,
Oh,
and
my
they made
gosh.
them call their moms, and like, yeah, like, do you know where your son is and what they're doing right now?
Good.
That they are deliberately taking advantage of,
Yes.
black and brown, pain and outrage
Yeah,
right
yeah.
now
Yeah, that's
to raid a
horrible.
liquor store. So, it's
Mm-hmm.
been, but I think communities are trying to figure out, how do you show up
Yeah,
for each other? How do you have
right.
uncomfortable conversations?
Mm-hmm.
Those types of things.
That's so just amazing to hear. I haven't spoken to anyone from Minneapolis. So,
Yeah.
thank you for sharing all that and so much insight. So my next question, which is coming from your experience in 2012 with cultural appropriation, and
Okay.
I personally like to know more because I like fashion as well, and I'm
Hmm.
big in supporting cultures and but not culturally appropriating, hopefully, and
Yeah.
Native American especially too, 'cause spiritually I appreciate that too, that you guys are so
Hmm.
spiritual. So how was that when you challenged Urban Outfitters and your whole campaign to, I think it was, I don't remember what, but it was it an earring or some kind of
Yeah, it
political,
was
yeah,
and
piece.
so it wasn't just me. There was tons of people,
Okay,
including the
that's great.
Navajo Nation involved. And so there's something called the Native American Arts and Crafts Act,
Mm,
which basically says you cannot take the name of a tribal nation and put it on a product
mm,
that's not actually from the tribe and then make a profit, a monetary
mm.
profit off of it.
Okay, got
So
it.
that's federal law. And so they had violated that by using the term Navajo, which
Mm,
is the name of, the Dene people was what they call themselves,
mm,
of their nation. And so they actually did sue them. And
mm.
I believe that, there's a trademark infringement, trademark lawsuit. And so,
Good.
yeah, I think, unfortunately with Native folks, it's like we encounter cultural appropriation every single day. And I think,
Same.
exactly, it's a huge issue. And I think for me, I used to be a lot more like extreme and kind of more militant and passionate about the issue.
Hmm, hmm.
And over the years, I think as I've matured, I've also kind of gotten to the space where like I was putting so much energy there and it was really exhausting.
Burning out, yeah.
And it's like, the energy that you put trying to change
Mm,
non-natives, particularly white folks, attitudes and behaviors, when you
hmm,
could be putting that same energy in your own community and
hmm,
around solutions and all of these other things. So
mm,
I feel like I've kind of made it my own journey kind of into a different realm that's more focused on like, changing the dominant narrative by actually uplifting, authentic, real Indigenous voices and
right.
focusing on solutions.
Yeah.
Um, and it's not to say I don't care about the issue because it's still there and I
Hmm.
definitely care about it. Um, but it's also like I feel like I could spend, folks could spend every single day
For sure.
challenging it and it's
Of
super
course.
exhausting. And as far I think where I also stand on it is
Hmm.
understanding I can only speak for myself. And I'll say this like
Yes.
every single
Same.
time because I think a lot
Same.
of times, like folks want, oh, what does the Chinese community, what does the
Hmm,
Black, what does the Native
hmm,
community, and
hmm,
understanding it's
hmm,
like,
hmm.
you don't have people who are like, well, what is the white opinion, on voting? It's like,
Yeah.
you really, I can only speak for me. I can't even
Right.
speak for my family or my tribe. I can just speak
Hmm,
for me.
hmm.
And how I feel on the issue now is that, um, if there are Native artists and fashion designers, I mean, we have incredible jewelry makers, artists, fashion designers, you name it.
Hmm.
And if non-Native folks want to buy items from them, I personally am comfortable with that, as long as you are actually putting money back into Indian country, putting
Hmm.
money to support, Native artists,
Hmm.
and you can respect what you're buying.
Hmm.
Um, and also know there's going to be folks who might feel differently.
Hmm.
Um, and I think a good practice is, if you see something you like, ask the creator, hey, as a non-native person, do you think it's cool if I wear this?
Hmm.
There's folks like Lauren Goodday from North Dakota, like Bethany Yellowtail, who is been featured in Vogue. I mean,
Hmm.
amazing fashion designers, who do have non-native folks wear and rock their apparel,
Hmm.
um, which I think, I respect, because it's getting visibility out there. And a lot of
Hmm.
times you do need to make money, from
Sure.
outsiders too.
Hmm.
And you're supporting these women, you're supporting their businesses. So as long as the money is going to these native, artists, I'm okay with it. I think the
Hmm.
issue there for me personally is, if you have non-natives who are appropriating and then profiting off of that
Hmm.
appropriation, that's where the issue lies.
Hmm.
So always, seek out, find, native artists. There's more than enough out there. I mean, they're all over Instagram, everywhere.
Yeah, I think it's interesting to hear too, because you hear this with the Black community and their culture, the hip hop culture, and I think
Mm-hmm.
there's a lot, speaking personally from the Asian community, where internationally there's kind of like that back and forth and that, controversy too of, okay, when will you pay it forward with the credits, and
Yep.
instead of just taking the hip hop music and
Yep.
making a profit out of that.
Totally.
So, do you know personally, this is random, but it's because I actually really love fashion and like jewelry and all. Do you know
Yeah.
any on the top of your head that you can name drop just
Oh,
to,
no, I
yeah,
love Lauren personally. I love Lauren Goodday and Bethany
okay.
Yellowtail for fashion. They're amazing and worth every penny. And then there's artists like Elias Not Afraid, Gianni Whitehawk,
Hmm.
who are incredible. I mean, Elias is probably my favorite beater, although there's a lot of other
Oh,
people's.
yeah.
Um, and Diani, is a one of my best friends, and also a great,
Oh.
she does visual art, so she does amazing paintings, but she also does jewelry, as well. And there's so many people out there. I mean, like,
Yeah.
and what's, I think, fantastic is it's actually a great way to learn about the diversity of Native nations, that there
Mm-hmm.
isn't a singular form
Mm-hmm.
of beadwork, that depending on where you're from,
Oh.
your tribe, your lineage, you're going to use different materials. So that's why you'll see certain nations will use things maybe like, porcupine quills. Other nations might use
Mm.
things, from, if we go further north into Canada and
Mm-hmm.
Alaska and the Arctic area, you're going to see things, like, moose bone and seal hide, in
Mm.
in jewelry, in art. um,
Mm.
and it's a great way to learn and educate about, I think that's where I always want to start, is asking yourself, whose land am I on? Who are the indigenous
Mm.
peoples that
Mm.
were here and are still here?
Mm.
And then how can I also support, right? So that could
Mm.
start by putting money back, that could start
Mm.
by, just listening, learning, sharing,
Mm-hmm.
educating your kids, educating your family.
And
But yeah,
I,
I can send you tons
oh,
of
please do.
jewelry and fashion.
Yeah, I think that's interesting that you touch on the topic of, that's so respectful and amazing. Who was here first? And,
Hmm.
how do we respect the people here who are here first? Which is kind of, my, like, it's like interesting because it's like we get this all the time as Asians, like, go back to your own country, but it's
Hmm.
like, but who was here first? And we
Yeah,
forget about that too. And that
totally.
whole talk about, Christopher Columbus, and then now is it the Native American month in November, from what I've read. But
It's November, and then like we also do one in May, in Minnesota.
yes. Oh,
Uh,
okay.
yeah, we
Cool.
do both. And then Indigenous Peoples Day, which replaced, Columbus Day in
Okay.
many
Yes.
cities and even states across the nation in October,
Mm.
which is huge, and as it should be.
Yes.
And
Yes.
yeah, I think a lot of times, there's very good intentions. And for example, folks will say, okay, we're all a nation of immigrants, for example.
Mm-hmm.
And that narrative is actually really, detrimental to Indigenous
Mm,
peoples, because it
mm,
completely, is a form of erasure in not recognizing that, no, we are not all a nation of immigrants. And what
mhm,
about,
mhm,
the first
mhm.
peoples of these homelands? And what
Yeah.
about, the Indigenous nations that still exist here? And so a
Mm,
lot of times, there's these good intentions and
mhm.
unintended consequences.
Yeah, and I find that really interesting because it's, with the whole COVID outbreak and, there's just so much racism being opened up and at least people being
Hmm.
aware of. And so I've also heard, live videos where people are like, go back to your country, whether
Hmm.
you're a minority of some sort. So
Yep.
it's humbling to see that, So,
Yeah, that's been pretty bad here. I know in Minnesota, like,
oh,
we have
really?
a really huge Hmong population here.
Mm, mm,
Um, and I know that folks worked with the Attorney General here, Keith Ellison, and our
mm,
governor and lieutenant governor. And our lieutenant governor is an Indigenous woman, Peggy Flanagan, who's from the
that's
White Earth
awesome.
Nation. But
Mm,
they actually had to set up and work with the Minnesota Department of Human Rights to have a hotline because of, the amount of either hate crimes or,
mm,
extreme forms of racism that were happening to Asian American folks here, around
mm.
the virus, and just the xenophobia and hatred that were coming as a result.
And I think it's sad, but I hope that with everything that we're talking about, with the Native Americans and the name change and all these issues that are coming
Hmm.
forward, the Asians and the xenophobia with that and Black Lives Matter, that we can bring it forward and at least have, a thought-provoking change. And
Hmm.
so I also wanted to know, you were a college advisor
Yeah,
uh,
I was
in the past?
an
Yeah.
academic advisor at a
Hmm, hmm.
community college here in the Twin Cities.
And I wanted to know, were you specifically an advisor for the Native American
Hmm.
community?
Yep.
Awesome. So, what kind of issues that you saw from the youth that this comes back to perhaps systematic racism or,
Hmm.
the need to give more resources and insights to help the youth where they can kind of propel and move
Hmm.
forward as adults. What were
Yeah,
some things that, if you're comfortable sharing, that
for
you saw in
sure.
the youth during this time? Yeah.
Yeah, I think, so I was at the community college here, at MCTC, and had a really great, that's Minneapolis Community and Technical College, and had a really great experience. And I feel like I learned, it's always super cliche and people say this all the time, but I definitely learned way more from my students than I think I could have ever
Mm-hmm.
offered them.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, the biggest issues that I saw, and my journey was very different. I went to private school on full scholarship from the time I was in kindergarten all the way through college.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I've had a very different journey and been very privileged,
Mm,
in my own opportunities.
sure. Yeah.
And I think, for me, I felt like it was really important to also, how do I also take that and be able to, contribute,
Help.
give back, not
Mm-hmm.
in like a savior icky type of way, but, be also,
Mm-mm-mm.
how can I act as a resource for my own community?
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, I think at the college, one of the biggest challenges that I saw was the fact that, quite frankly, a lot of times students are not set up to succeed.
Oh,
While I
really?
was there, if we look at I think that we were lucky that we had several Native faculty members there, which is huge, and
Mm-hmm.
unfortunately not that common, in a lot of either mainstream or larger institutions.
Mm-hmm.
And so we were really lucky in that there were some really great Native faculty, and that, students could see themselves represented in their
Mm-hmm.
teachers, and they didn't have to confront, issues of being, the paternalistic attitudes,
Mm-hmm.
or having their own experiences or realities dismissed.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's something that's very common. But I did have students who were frequently in classes, who did experience very much either having to play the token Indian, in terms of
Oh,
having to
no.
educate their classes,
Yeah.
rather than having their professor be the one who actually had an understanding,
Right.
and education in
Yep.
Native, issues, Native history,
Mm-hmm.
and also the contemporary reality.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So often, I think one of the biggest challenges that we face, not biggest, but when we think about, representation, is that Native folks are very much either relegated to a historical past. So we only talk about Native issues in
Mm,
academia frequently in the past, right?
Mm-hmm.
And not in the present, or it's
Mm,
only done in an anthropological way and not in a,
mm,
well, what about science? What about,
mm,
mathematics, all of these other fields that
mhm,
our peoples can and are contributing to.
mm,
And then also just even having our own paradigms, thought systems, languages, and realities seen as, not enough or not
mm,
legitimate forms, of,
mm.
um, you know, either within academia or within
Yeah.
certain branches of academia. And I
Mm,
think that can be really exhausting.
yeah.
I've not gone beyond my getting my BA, but my fiance just graduated with his master's
Mm,
degree, which is huge. And I've also
cool.
just, been able to see through his journey also, the emotional labor that he has had to do in addition to getting his master's in terms
Mm,
of having to educate non-native folks,
mm,
non-native faculty, non-native
mm-hmm.
staff along the way, and do a lot of
Yeah.
work that quite frankly he should be getting paid to do.
Yeah.
But
Wow.
as Black,
Mm-hmm.
Indigenous, and people of color, so
Mm-hmm.
often we have to not only go through the challenges of
Yeah.
getting our degrees and going through, the really intense process of
Mm-hmm.
academia, but then we also have to educate folks along the way
Yeah.
and, be subjected to microaggressions and racism and challenges
Definitely.
that are exhausting.
Mm.
And I think it's one of the reasons, like, I don't know if I could do it moving forward.
Yeah, it's a lot. Mm-hmm.
And having to legitimize your own identity, having to legitimize
Mm.
your form of, knowledge, having to legitimize, your own history and ancestry is really exhausting. And I think,
Mm-hmm.
too, one of the biggest issues with for me that I saw within my own students is, um, because, and I've also done some work within, early education. And one of the issues too, because of boarding schools.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know if folks are totally familiar with boarding schools, but boarding schools, a lot of times when folks hear about it, they think about it in the 1800s. My dad went
Mm.
to boarding school, for example, so was really one of the last one Indian boarding schools. And that's
Mm-hmm.
very recent. So I would say, my generation we're the direct, the first generation in a lot of instances not to be in the boarding schools subjected to the reality that our parents' generation were.
Mm-hmm.
And the whole idea behind, Christian or missionary boarding schools was a tactic and tool used by the United States federal government to quote unquote, civilize indigenous peoples. So it was a
Yeah.
mechanism to sever
And
our
mm-hmm.
connections to our language, our culture,
Mm-hmm.
and instill us with white Eurocentric values.
It's kind of
So, for
like,
example, you are not allowed. Oh, go ahead.
oh no, please finish. Yeah.
Yeah, you're not allowed to speak your language. You're taken out of the
Mm,
home. You don't learn
mm,
certain things that you would growing up. You don't
mm-hmm.
have that connection to your family, your tribe, your
Mm-hmm.
nation that, you need as a child.
Mm-hmm.
And, I think understanding what we know now too is that it's hard to talk about this on a really, consolidated, but that boarding schools were also very much home to extreme sexual abuse, physical
Mm,
violence, and extreme trauma. I mean,
mm-hmm.
children died there, and a lot of
Mm,
folks never made it home, either literally or figuratively, in terms
mm,
of they were never the same again.
mm,
I know, for example, like, my dad went, my grandma went, my great grandma went,
mm-hmm.
and, early on, folks were forcibly removed from their homes. They were mandated by the
Mm,
federal government, to be in there. And then later on, you had tactics like my grandma, for example, was very much shamed for being poor. Okay, you
mm,
can't provide for your kids. You went to
mm,
boarding school. You need to also now be in a place. This is what you do. And I think, she was trying to do what she could for her kids.
mm,
My dad went to boarding school at St. Augustine's,
mm.
and he ran away when he
Oh
was, I
wow.
think, about 11 or 12 years old, and
Mm,
he ran away wearing girls' clothing with a shaved head. And part of that was one of the things that they would do to the boys to punish them was to demasculate them.
oh my
So they would make
gosh.
them wear girls' clothing, shave your hair, beat you. I mean, it's very, I think we talk about these things, and for a lot of folks, it's unimaginable, but this was very much the reality.
Yeah.
And it also created, a generation that my dad talks about this all the time, didn't necessarily know, even how to show love, how to be a
Mm,
parent. All of that was taken away.
mm,
And so you had very
mm,
much, these generational consequences from the
mhm.
boarding schools that impacted their descendants and their children who weren't even there. And my dad was really lucky
Mm,
that, he didn't stay there. He ended up in a juvenile boys home, which he
mm.
always talks about how much he loved it there.
Oh,
But by
yeah.
comparison, it was a much better place. Not a good
Mm,
place, but a better place.
mm,
And so, because of the boarding schools, and it's much more complex, and there's other folks out
I'm
there who could
sure.
do way better and much greater justice than I could in talking about
Yeah.
this. But you have a community who has a very real and deeply entrenched distrust of the
Mm.
educational systems.
Yep.
So, and
Yep.
so, for example, there in a lot of our homes, there's not the same support, right,
Mm,
for education, particularly mainstream white Western education.
mm,
There's this historic distrust, and so there's very unique barriers that Indigenous folks face
mm,
within academia, and then also within our own communities in terms of pursuing it
mhm,
and succeeding. And like I said, a lot of these institutions are not set up for Indigenous folks to succeed.
mm,
I think that's changing, and there's amazing folks who are out there who are breaking down barriers, who are getting their masters, their PhDs, and want to really transform it and create a
mm.
system where we uplift Indigenous values and
Yes.
create, educational environments that value our students and our
Mhm,
cultures. So a lot's
mm.
changing, which is great, but
Yes.
I just know here in the city, like it was amazing students and really challenging to also be able to know, like, that they were also facing realities that I could do my best, but I could not change.
Mm. I think that's, first of all, thank you for sharing such a very deep and personal experience from your family. And I think that's what we need to hear is I
Mhm.
didn't know, like I've actually read very briefly about, I remember in like elementary, but from hearing your personal experience and your father's experience, I
Mhm.
do believe also that it is true that there is a generational pain. Yeah, I speak
Mhm.
for myself too, as an Asian American, as a child of immigrant, our parents, whatever experience they go through, there is this this generational pain that we become
Totally.
like almost like a container, and
Mhm.
to be able to break that, and like you said, like young people moving forward in the future, making changes is a beautiful thing, so thank you for doing that.
Yeah,
um,
absolutely.
we have 10 more minutes left, and I
Okay.
just wanted to throw out, which is great because there's always so much to chat, and it's always great to hear and
Mhm.
learn, and so humbling to hear from you and your experience from Native American community. But guys, if you guys have any questions, just want to shout out and say, like, please ask Sasha. She's been so welcoming and awesome, and all the way out from Minneapolis, Minnesota. I'm just like, oh, we're from LA, so cool, thank you, like, but that I think these stories that you say, it really has to hit the heart to really change people and
Yeah,
be like, hey, wait a minute, um, we got to kind of, go back a little and remember that we got to come together and do this.
for
Um,
sure. Yeah.
but also, do you have any other resources? I think I've mentioned, that people can research, you can name drop, if they want to know more, and how can they, orgs that they can donate to, or
Definitely, yes. So I think one right now, so Illuminative, so it's spelt, kind of Illuma and then the N is capitalized native.
mm-hmm,
They are a nonprofit organization who's really specifically working on kind of changing the dominant narrative of how Native peoples are represented in mainstream media.
mm-hmm,
And they have Crystal Echohawk is the executive director there,
mm-hmm,
and they have just a ton of research on, the issue. So I had mentioned Dr. Stephanie Freiberg.
mm-hmm,
She's partnered with Illuminative around different issues around, like I had said, the from issues related to mascots and perceptions, but also, how do we actually start changing visibility? Whether that's in
mm-hmm,
how do we change, the educational system where folks are actually teaching accurate histories and representations, and then looking
mm-hmm.
at film and television,
Yes.
and then also looking at, pop culture and different issues from, that are impacting Native peoples. And what I really respect about them is they're just really trying to elevate the contemporary lived reality and voices of
Mhm.
Native folks, which is
Mhm.
just really challenging, the mainstream. And they have
Yes.
toolkits too on their website of like different issues, break it down, really easy, accessible ways to understand, and then also how to be an ally. So how to take action
Mhm.
on different issues, um, taking very complex issues and being able to be very real about it.
Mhm.
And yeah, so I have a tremendous respect for them and see them as real leaders on that issue. And then also I think they're doing some great work on like, uplifting the voices of Native youth as well.
Mm.
Another one that I had, I think mentioned was Indian Collective. And so they are actually
Mhm.
really rethinking about, the nonprofit industrial complex and philanthropy,
Mm.
and are actually a Native funder,
Mm.
which is that's huge. I think so often we have white philanthropic institutions who are dictating, what gets funded. And so
Man,
it's
yeah.
like, you're right. It's like,
There's the
oh,
system right
we
there. Yeah.
exactly. And so it's, instead of going in and saying to the communities, what do you want to do and
Yeah.
what are the issues, or having that lived experience, as we often see these white philanthropic institutions who
Mm.
have good intentions but don't know the lived reality and are saying,
Mm.
okay, well, we want you to work on X, so
Mhm.
you meet our needs and create this, proposal, and we'll fund it. I
Mhm.
think what Indian Collective is doing is saying, as Native people ourselves, we're actually going to be funding Native issues, and we're going to be a funder, to
Mm.
change, how philanthropy operates, which is
Mm.
huge.
That is.
And so they've been super active, like you had mentioned, on the issues around, everything from, the Black Hills issue. Their executive
Mm.
director, Nick Tilson, was the one who was arrested.
Mm.
And then they've also just been really vocal and active on even everything around, had funding opportunities related to COVID, Native arts, environment,
Mm.
looking at, the realities of environmental racism, fighting toxic,
Mhm.
pipelines, dams, and
Mhm.
environmental degradation on Native
Mhm.
lands.
Mhm.
So those are two big ones. I think Indian Country Today is a great media outlet
Mm.
for folks. They have all, Native staff, Native led kind of news site where you
Mm.
can really figure out, what the issues are, read Native writers. And that's the big thing for me is I think having folks, right, like
Yeah.
any of our communities, letting folks speak for themselves, letting them speak for our communities,
Mhm.
rather than having, outside folks
Mhm.
kind of tell the stories.
Yes.
So Indian Country Today is a great resource, and they do great reporting. They even have like every day the facts on COVID and how it's impacting Indian country. So those are kind of like three big ones that come to mind. But then, also finding, different, in the same way, there's, I read a really great piece. It was in the New York Times, and it was talking about, you know,
Oh, got kind of.
and talking
Mhm.
about how, oh, sorry about that. It was a
A
really
little.
great story,
It's
and
okay.
it,
No, it might be me too. Yeah.
oh no, how we need to look at, Black authors in all different realms, not just fighting white supremacy and racial justice, but we need to value their
Mm.
work in all of the different disciplines and celebrate Black joy. And I very much,
Mm.
I love that. And I also think too, like for folks like finding, Native authors who do, science
Yes.
fiction, finding Native
Yes.
authors who do, because they're out there,
Mhm.
finding, fashion designers and
Mhm.
scholars and actors. And I think that
Mhm.
also really combats the notion of relegating this, Native peoples to either one genre or the historical
Mm.
past.
Mm.
And that's something I would love to see. I'd love to see, in terms of mainstream media, turning on a show, and rather than just having the native actor, if there even is a native actor, so
Yeah.
frequently it's not even a native actor if there's a native role,
Right.
having them play something, then, the Indian sidekick, or, having them be able to
Mm.
play a contemporary real role. Like that
Yeah.
would be huge and revolutionary.
Mhm.
And that's
Same.
such a
Mhm.
simple ask. And I think,
Mhm.
so many of our communities experience that, where we don't get to play, the girlfriend, or just, the
Yeah.
teacher, or the leading role or anything. We have to be relegated to a very racialized
Mhm.
archetype. So being able to challenge that, is huge. But yeah, seek out, even, Netflix, there's native made films on there,
Mhm.
there's, native music, being able to just be open, explore, educate, find resources, And like I said before, starting with, whose homelands am I occupying?
Hmm.
Who are the indigenous peoples to, where I am living, and educating ourselves on that. There's even,
Mm.
like literally you can Google it and, there's different
Yes.
apps on there that will tell you like, this is the name of, the tribe, this is the name of the nation,
Mm.
whose homelands, are here, and give you more information as a starting point. So I think that would be a good one. And yeah, I think just
Awesome.
those would be great starting points. And I really appreciate, you reaching out and also knowing like, I have my own work to do and learning to
Hmm.
do. And really appreciate the opportunity just to speak about my experience,
Hmm.
and hope to be able to learn and listen to you and ask you a bunch of questions one day too.
Well, thank you so much, Sasha. You're such a pleasure to speak to, and it always is a learning experience. There's always something to learn, and I think for me, my biggest fear, even growing up, was like, okay, like how do I, be politically correct? I don't want to offend people, but
Mhm.
sometimes it's just being able to be humble and saying, hey, like I need to work on me and
Yep.
listen. Hmm.
Totally. And that's the biggest
So,
takeaway for me is like, be okay with making mistakes as long as
hmm,
you learn from them, and that we're all going to make mistakes along the way. And it's better to ask questions, than
yes.
assume.
Right. Well, now it says we got 2 minutes, which is perfect timing. But do you have like something that you were raised with, either your dad or something that you can kind of close in and take away, like, oh yeah, this, but a quote or something
Oh my
that,
God, my dad is hilarious and also like wild and really like he's like the sweetest, most rugged person you'll ever meet. And there's a radio show called Native America Calling, and he calls
uh-huh.
in. It's on every day, I think
Oh
Monday through Friday. He calls in every show, so they know
my
him by
gosh.
first name, and they're always like, "Oh, it's Melvin from Santee." And
Hey.
then he'll like call us like it's big news. Like he's like, "I was on Native America Calling," and we're like,
Oh.
we know, and so
Yeah.
then, we'll hear from him. But I think something he always has told me is that you have to
Hmm.
learn, he always says, and he says this and everything, is in order to understand your future, you have to understand your past.
Yes.
And
Agreed.
so I think that's
Yeah.
something for everybody, right? Like, knowing more about where you came from, what has happened to your peoples, your communities, your own family, and
Hmm.
learning from both the mistakes
Hmm.
and the victories, and
Yeah.
applying that to our future.
Mm.
Because, the struggles today are not new, they've been here. And it's important that we learn from the generation before us, and their
Absolutely.
mistakes and their amazing accomplishments.
Perfect. Well, beautifully said. We got 20 seconds left. So thank you, thank you, thank you. I wish you and your family, and I wish I can give your dad a hug too, or a virtual COVID hug.
If
But
he does
you
have
too.
internet now, so
Hey.
we might be able to hook him up with you one day.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Sasha, for your time and your humbleness.